All right, hello world. This is CS50 on Twitch. My name is Colton Ogden, and this is the third code review we've done with David and Brian. This is Brian's second time being on our code review. Yeah, it was a good time last time. We covered a lot of different languages, and this time we'll be doing much of the same.
Oh, nice. It's good to be back. We're looking forward to all the submissions that everyone sent in by the Google form, and we picked out a few such samples to look at today.
David even dressed up just for this occasion.
I did, a very formal code review, so I'm taking this one very seriously.
Thanks to Hacker Becca for following just before the stream. We have a lot of people in the chat. I say we just cut straight to the first demo that we're going to look at today, which is actually a really nice one. So let me go ahead and bring it over to Clear Strike by Samarth GR.
Yeah, so what do we have here, Colton?
So when I was looking at this, it looked like a CLI version of a game that's very popular in South Asia called Karam or Karam. I'm not entirely sure how it's pronounced. But it's very similar, and I actually have it on Wikipedia there on the second tab if you want to pull that over. So there's a picture of the board, and folks might be able to see it underneath the chat with varying ease.
Yeah, sure. Should we enhance?
Yeah, let's enhance a little. Well, no, too much enhancement. There we go. So it's very similar to, and I haven't played this myself or looked too deeply into it, but it's a version of Pool essentially with what look like checker pieces, where there's a sort of a cue piece that you get knock in at the very end, the queen piece, so to speak. And the app that we'll be looking at is sort of a CLI version of this, which is kind of an interesting implementation.
Nice. Well, yeah, if you've played this game in the real world, do feel free to chime in, especially to correct anything assumptions we're making. Fortunately, we'll focus on the code itself. And indeed, yeah, in response to one of the questions that was just asked here by, I lost track.
I have the code.
Oh, we have it up there?
Yeah.
Yeah, can we make that a little bigger? Oh, that one's fine. That one's fine. So yes, the kind of code review that we've been doing in these streams would be akin to what you might do with a colleague or a manager in the real world at a company. Often these code reviews, though, would be done asynchronously, so via GitHub or some similar web-based tool. But doing things in person is not uncommon as well.
Yeah.
All right, should we dive in?
Yeah, sounds good. Let's take a look.
All right, so the repository that Samarth kindly contributed was last worked on 27 days ago, and I can see that right over here on GitHub, which means this is quite fresh off the presses, so to speak, this code. And I'm seeing a whole bunch of files here, just under 10 or so files and folders. How would you, Brian, go about wrapping your mind around what to do if you've never seen a project before and you want to start reviewing it to give someone helpful feedback?
All right, well, the first file that sort of catches my eye is main.py. Often main acts as an entry point for a program, so it seems like a reasonable place to start looking.
Okay.
Trying to figure out how this works.
All right, and how would you approach reading a file for the very first time? That's not part of an assignment, but indeed as a whole project.
So first thing I'd probably take a look at is it looks like there are a couple of functions that are defined here, so I might just glance through the file and get a sense for the functions. We have a function called load turns here. Down a little bit beneath that, we have a function called main near the bottom of the screen right now that I'm guessing is probably where the game is going to begin. Main tends to be a common first function that gets called in the program, but we can keep scrolling down to find out if that's actually the case. And yeah, so on line 58, this sort of cryptic syntax, if you've never seen it before, the if underscore underscore name underscore underscore equals main is Python's way of saying, like, if I am running this Python file and trying to execute it, this is the code that should run. And it looks like it does some initial setup, and then down on line 89, it actually calls that main function. So this is actually, inside of this if condition might be the place to start to at least get a sense for it.
I think Brian has an opinion here.
It does seem like it's perhaps a little bit less conventional to be putting a lot of logic in the if underscore underscore name equals main and then run through a whole bunch of logic and then call the main function. It seems like a lot of this information about initializing the parser, checking the arguments, loading the inputs based on these comments. I do like the commenting. It helps to make it clear as to what things go in what sections, but I would say that probably all of this could just go inside of the main function or even go into separate functions inside of the main function. Doesn't seem to me there's much of a reason to separate the main function functionality from this code.
Indeed, and to be clear, let me go ahead and temporarily pretend to edit this file, even though we won't be able to save the changes since it's not actually ours. If I go and scroll down here, what Brian is alluding to is a very common paradigm that you actually see in a few of CS50's own examples, whereby you don't actually put much code at all in this block. Let me just temporarily delete that. You would instead just quite simply call the main function. So for those unfamiliar, like, why is there this paradigm? Because I dare say in an introductory course like CS50, this is just atrocious syntax, I think, when someone is learning Python for the first time. So what problem does this actually solve?
Yeah, so one thing that distinguishes Python from a language like C is that when you execute a C program, the main function is a function that has it's a special function that when you execute the program, the compiler knows that the main function is the first function that should run when you execute program. Python's not like that. So if you define a file that just has a main function, and then you try and execute that file by typing Python and then the file name .py, it's not going to run the main function out of the box. Main is just the name of any other function that could be any other name. And so this line down here is supposed to say, all right, when you run the function, we actually want to run the main function as the first thing that happens in the file. And the extra syntax of the if underscore underscore name equals underscore underscore main is to account for different ways in which we might use a file in Python. So we could just try and run a file by running python main.py in this case, where we want to run the main function. But you could imagine if there are variables or functions defined in a file that we want to use in some other file. We don't want to actually run the main function. We probably just want to import it, for example.
So apologies for the interruption. It looks like some people are saying the sound is low. Just want to confirm that that's indeed the case. Some people are saying that it got fixed. Brian, would you mind saying a few words?
Hey, testing, testing.
And then David, can you say a few things?
Testing, testing.
And then 1, 2, 3. So let us know. Sound is going from loud to low intermittently, says methodology.
Yeah, it's still happening, it looks like, thanks to Kaiza Twitch here.
Okay, well, we have somebody is currently working on it, so apologies for the sound issue. Hopefully we'll get that fixed. And then Adamantine saying sound is good right now. Voy T, thank you very much for the follow here. Folks, anybody who has any issues with the sound, definitely let us know so we can see if it's maybe localized or whether it's still going or what the issue might be, perhaps.
So far, so good? All right. So just to be clear, in most cases, what we could even do, if you do want to have a main function, is just literally in the last line of your code, just call main itself, thereby kicking off the whole process of running this file. The additional presence of this condition here that Brian is describing really only solves a problem for more sophisticated programs where you indeed might want to import them if you're making a library or a Python package or module of your own. But if it helps to keep things in mind more simply for now, just do this at the end of the file. But I definitely concur with Brian's assessment that probably shouldn't have as much logic as was in here. That's the whole point of having main, is move this into the main function
I don't
itself.
know if you brought this up already, but having that if name equals main, great for test cases. Did you mention that already?
No, I don't think we can.
What do you mean by test cases?
Like having, if you were to have the tests for a module within a module so you could run it and test its correctness, you could have all of those test cases be within main, within that module, and then run them that
Within
way.
main the file, not main the function.
If you were to test this module and have a set of test cases that, for example, let's say this came with a bunch of functions, you could import it in as some library, or if you want to test this module for correctness on its own, you could execute this module by itself, and within its main function, it would execute a set of test cases.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Makes sense. And I think I saw in the main root directory, the repository, there is a test directory. So it looks like this writer may have written some tests for their code as well.
And I'm guessing there's probably a more idiomatic way to do TDD with some other system that doesn't use that. But.
So just a few quibbles, if I may, in terms of the style of this file. So I see what we're using single quotes up here, which is perfectly fine in Python. It's slightly easier to type because you don't have to hold the shift key. But then I'm seeing double quotes everywhere else, and I'm not seeing a particularly compelling reason to switch in that way. Down here, we're back to single quotes for some reason. Down here, we're at double quotes. So to me, this just is a bit sloppy. It's an easy thing to fix, but it also just presents yourself better, especially if someone is going to read your code or modify your code. You want to be diligent about things like this. Even more nitpickily, I'm seeing that this comment here is not capitalized. This one is not. So here, too, there's just sort of a sloppiness that, at the risk of reading into it too much, just suggests, hey, if you're not even getting the basics right like that, maybe the code itself isn't as strong as it should be. And I think you want to be putting your best foot forward. Here too, this looks like this just commented out, and that's fine if the project is still in development, but really in your master branch, the main branch of your repository, everything that's there should be there, and this should have just been deleted, I think, from that branch. And in terms of where else to go, one of the very first lines here were these imports up here. Let me go back to the previous view of this screen so that we have a sense of where we're going to go. It looks like Samarth, who was implementing this, imported some of his own files, so caramboard.py, player.py, and so forth. So that's a nice modularization, it would seem, of the code. It's not all just in one massive file. Should we take a look at, say, the main function itself?
Sure.
All right. So I'm seeing here that main takes in a few arguments, which is okay, but that's kind of violating the spirit of main. Main should really be taking command line arguments, if anything, but it doesn't need to take that in Python because you can get access to those via sys.argv. So I would keep this simple and more Pythonic and just have it def main, open paren, close paren, and that's it. I do see that he's changed commenting styles here, but this is probably a good thing. Do you mind speaking to this convention?
Yeah, these triple quotation marks that you might have seen before are what's called a doc string in Python, and this is often conventional for documenting the behavior of a function or documenting the behavior of a class like player or carom board are, which we might take a look at later. And so conventionally, underneath main, you'll have triple quotation marks and then a description of what it is that this function does. And oftentimes, you'll also see this as an opportunity to talk about what the types of the arguments should be, what the return type of the function is if the function is returning something, and just helps to document the behavior of the function. And then a whole bunch of tools that have the ability to actually read that doc string and use the doc string in order to inform someone who's using the function how it is that the function actually works.
Yep, indeed. Let me go ahead and go back to the editable version just so we can make some tweaks as we go, though no tweaks necessary there.
Kind of oddly, Python does its doc string sort of underneath the function signature, whereas in a language like Java, it would be placed above the function signature.
Yeah, I can see the motivation, because it means when you're parsing the function, the doc string is actually part of the function and not just randomly appended above it.
Yeah.
But it feels a little weird given those conventions too. Here, I'd just be a little neater. Like, give me some white space before your next comment so I can just understand that this is relating to the code below it, not just commented out or something like that.
Right.
I would like a little more detail here. You do say that this is initial coin details for the carom board, and frankly, if I knew more about the game itself, this might go without saying. But why 9, why 1, I would elaborate at least for the reader, just so that we're not questioning the design decision down the road. Here's pretty reasonable, I think. Initializing 2 players using the constructor function here, the player such and such. Strictly speaking, I'm not sure you gain much by declaring player 1 and player 2 unless, I'm not even seeing those variables used elsewhere. So I would honestly probably just simplify this, and let me go ahead and grab this. And personally, I would probably do this, passing in player 1 name and player 2 name, just so as to not add variables unnecessarily. It's just something else to think about. It's something to accidentally misuse. And because the line of code is still pretty darn short, I think this is pretty clean, but I think reasonable people could disagree on that one.
People would probably say that's the Pythonic way to do it,
Yeah, I mean, in that case, too, you might not even want these 2 names here separately, although those did come in, I think, as arguments. So that's to be expected up in main's actual signature.
Someone asked, and this is separate, but someone was asking about sections for the web and games course. I don't know if, Brian, your course has online sections that we made available?
Not for the edX course, no. There are certainly, if you're looking for additional support with any of the online classes like the web class or the games class, if you log into the edX page on the right-hand side, there are a whole bunch of CS50 communities that you can join. So there's a Discord server, there's a Slack, there's Reddit and Stack Exchange that you can go on in order to ask questions and interact with other students, but there are no sections per se for the edX course.
And I see a little earlier on, Whipstreak23 asked or noted that he's been using Python for 2 years and never used name = main. And that's fine, because it really is a solution to a problem, and you don't need to solve that problem if you've not yet encountered it, as by writing your own library code that might warrant it as well. If you use Python for web like Flask or Django, you'll encounter it. Might still be true for Django. Flask's recommended method is no longer to use a main function. You should actually be running a program called Flask to initiate execution of the server, but you will see that in older versions of Flask. And I think there was one other question. Do you mind scrolling up just a little bit?
Sure, yeah.
Can we go back in the questions? And Babak Knight asks, why not a separate test file? To, I think, Colton's comment earlier, you could absolutely factor out any test to a separate file. However, if I were writing a pretty small library, for instance, CS50's own library, I might just keep everything together because it keeps things simple. Only when it becomes unwieldy should you actually solve a problem.
Sure.
Not until it exists.
And then Adamantine was saying, while you're on the topic, is there anywhere I can find the sample code that was shown in class examples for the web programming course?
That should all be linked on the curriculum page on edX.
Yeah, if you go to the courseware page, everything should be there in a set of blue links or red links associated with each and every lecture. All right, well, let's take a closer look at some of the code here. We're still in that main function, and I think it's pretty straightforward. We seem to be initializing the carom board here, and yes, very excitedly having created it. We're going to go ahead and start playing here. Here on line 45, we're calling a method, it would seem, called play inside of the board, and I like that kind of modularization. There's this notion of playing the board. Down here, we're printing out the results. That, too, makes sense to encapsulate as part of the board, if only because, one, the carom board is representing a real-world object, the real-world board, and it also allows you, theoretically, to even have multiple boards in memory simultaneously, especially for testing purposes or the like. Here, I feel like there's maybe an opportunity for improvement. Do you know where my mind is wandering with comparing these literal strings here?
Yeah, I see at least two possible ways that you could approach maybe improving the design here. So the issue that I think we're both touching on here is that we're comparing result.outcome to a string, where the string is won or draw. And whenever you're dealing with a situation where there are only like a fixed number of possible outcomes for the game, it could be won or it could be drawn, comparing it to a string is not necessarily the best way to go. It becomes easier to potentially make mistakes if wherever I'm setting the result, I accidentally have a typo somewhere, for instance, and it's not won or draw. Then you could run into unexpected behavior that you're not expecting. And so sometimes you can come up with ways of trying to work around that problem. So I can imagine maybe you make outcome an enum, for instance, where it can only be one of a fixed number of possible values. And so you can guarantee that will always be one or the other. Or even it looks like the way they're doing this is they care about result.outcome, and when it's won, they print out the player that won the game. So I might imagine maybe just like having a variable called like who the winner is. And if the winner is set to either the player who won it, or if there is no winner, then it could be set to none, which is just a default Python value representing the absence of a value. And I could imagine if result.winner is equal to none, then that tells you that the game is a draw because there is no winner. So you can imagine a number of possible ways you could go about trying to architect that.
Yeah, and because Python is loosely typed too, you can effectively achieve ternary states. If you were to use a variable called not outcome, but called one, you could say that result, you could check whether result.one equals true, or if it equals false, or if it is some other state, it could be none, which gives you a third option as well, which is, I think is in the spirit of what you're saying. Now, you mentioned enum before, and I don't think we can do that in Python per se.
There are classes that you can extend, but I guess that's probably more complicated. And in fact, I don't even think this needs to be ternary now that I look at it. I think it can just be binary, just true or false.
Well, I don't know enough about the game, but I imagine the game could be won, a draw, or still in progress, which is why there might not be an outcome yet.
Oh,
but this is only happening after they print game ended. So I'm assuming at this point in time.
I guess so, yeah.
I don't know enough about the game to be sure.
And a technique I just saw in a library I've been using recently is actually to use class constants, even though they're not technically constant. Can I go ahead and open up a little scratchpad here?
Sure.
What you could do, whoops, wrong page there. Let me go back. How do I do this in Windows? There we go. All right, so let me go into one of the other files, like the Karen board, which I think is going to be in its own file here.
And also thanks to Vaudevillain, Jilfy90, and I can't read that username, but it looks like Korean text. Thank you very much for the follows.
Wonderful. And so I think what you could do here in your class is do something that's very common in Java and in other languages, but actually declare class level variables. And correct me if I'm wrong on the syntax. I think we could do something like, let's say, how could we do this? Outcome equals 1. We could have a variable called 1 and set it equal to any old value, whether it's 1 or even 1, for instance. And then we could have draw equals draw, just a string representation of it. And then in my other code, correct me if I'm wrong, I could down here, if I scroll down to where we left off at the very bottom, I could say something like if result.outcome equals Karen board .1 to actually check as though it is a constant, even though Python doesn't give us those same constraints as some languages.
It would be the class name though, not the object name, right?
I think both would work actually.
It's probably more conventional to use the class name, although I think you can still get away with both.
Yeah, Karen board here .1. So it's a little sloppy, but at least in this way you're not comparing against a hard-coded string that maybe will change for grammatical purposes, or if you internationalize the game and therefore you have different languages speaking those strings, you don't want to necessarily hard-code strings, I think.
And some folks might know this as being a static variable or Python's implementation thereof.
Yeah, the closest you can get.
Something you'd see maybe in Java or C#.
Indeed.
What's the difference between CS50 on edX and CS50 course website? Are lectures divided into more bite sizes? Or
No, the same content is there on Harvard College's website and edX. It's just a different user interface. And how long will the CS50 Beyond series be? We might offer it again next year. Brian most recently put this online, but that's picks up where CS50 leaves off and is a shorter version of what is Brian's web programming class, which is already on edX.
Cool.
All right, so where next to look? I think if we look at the top of the file, perhaps, there is this other function, load turns, but should we take a look maybe at the class itself before moving on to another project?
From when I was looking at this, it looked like Karen board was the largest module in this project by far.
Oh, lovely. So let's see, we have, okay. Well,
but the good news is, when I was reading this, it looked very well commented.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so let's go all the way back up to the top and none of my
Yeah,
familiar keyboard shortcuts
the
work
macOS
here.
keyboard shortcuts don't work. Yeah, it's weird. You have to use
Oh, page up.
page up, yeah, and
Home, there we go.
home,
Okay.
yeah.
Whew, okay, so actually here is something similar, it seems, to what you were describing earlier, or what I was describing earlier, of having sort of class-level constants in a file called config.py, inside of which is a settings something or other.
It looks like a config directory inside of which is the settings.py most likely.
Okay, nice. All right. And then we seem to be importing an abstraction of a player, implemented probably as a class, that I'm inferring from the capitalized P here. All right, so here's the class name. We have a really big doc string that's nice. I think this does go in much more detail than we've seen thus far as to how this all works. I'm seeing an init method. Now, those of you who are unfamiliar with classes, a class is just a construct in Python and in Java and in C++ for encapsulating related pieces of data as well as pieces of functionality. So if you've only studied C, as in CS50, you might recall structs in C, which allow you to encapsulate or group together similar pieces of data. A class does that and more. You can also have functions, otherwise known as methods, built into it as well. And in Python, it's a bit curious because if you want to initialize a class, or specifically an object of that class, so class is like what would you call it, like a blueprint or a mold out of which you can make multiple copies of it, one or more carom boards. You see this function in Python quite commonly. Do you want to speak to what this is being used for?
Yeah, so this is what we would call like a class constructor. Basically, this is a function that will run that will create what we'll call an instance of a carom board. So this class is defining a blueprint of what it means to create one such board. And
I'm just going to sign in again while you do that.
and,
Okay, you guys.
I think we deleted the init function accidentally.
Oh,
All right, there we go. And when we say in main.py, you may have recalled we used carom board in capital C, capital B, and then in parentheses we passed in the coins and the players. That was implicitly calling this init method to say, let's create a new board. And the nice thing about this object-oriented syntax is that you can use this to create arbitrarily many boards. If you wanted to have 3 games running simultaneously, you could create 3 carom boards each time invoking this init method, and that would create 3 different boards that have their own set of variables, that have their own state and own functionality.
And Brian did an object-oriented programming stream actually fairly recently. So if you're watching on CS50 or YouTube, definitely check that one out. If you're on Twitch, I think the bot's probably still up right now.
Nice. All right, so we see here a few different checks here, a lot of good error checking. I think this looks a lot like code that I write, where the very top of my function, I do a lot of if, else ifs. I might iterate over a whole bunch of variables just to make sure they're of the right type. Looks like we're using, some art here is using value error, which is a built-in exception to Python, which just connotes you have done something wrong with some value. If you pass in a string to it, that is the exceptions message that the user will see, or the programmer will see, which is nice. I see we have some kind of dictionary here of coin types that we could see if we dived into that config file, most likely, to see what we're validating here. You're looking askance.
Yeah, if coin types is actually a dictionary, I don't know whether it is. I'm assuming it is because we're calling .keys. I actually think the .keys is probably not necessary here. That if you want to check if coin is a key inside the dictionary, you could just omit the .keys.
That's true, because keys is going to return a list of the keys in the dictionary, which is just a redundant operation if you can already do it by way of the in operator. That's a good point. All right, so we're checking some types just to make sure that the user has passed in the right variables, it would seem.
Yeah, it's worth also mentioning that it's a little bit more, this will work. You can use the type function in Python to get the type of a particular variable and like check if players is in fact a list. It's a little bit more Pythonic and more recommended in Python to use actually a different function, which exactly, the isInstance method or function, and that's going to, syntax like that will say, if players is an instance of list, which is effectively doing a very similar thing. It's more recommended for a couple of reasons, but one is to deal with the possibility of classes that are inheriting from other classes. So you could imagine, for instance, if I defined a class called book, for example, and I defined a new class called hardcover book that is a type of book, like a specific type of book, and now I have a hardcover book and I want to check to see if it is in fact a book. If I just checked if the type is equal to book, it's not going to match up, but if I check if it's an instance of a book, then I'll get the result that I expect. So long story short, it's usually preferable to use isInstance over just checking if type is equal to something.
And actually, back up to the line 36 here. I'm guessing if they're currently checking to see if coin is in a a sort of collection, we could probably use a set here if they're all unique. We have to look at coin types and verify that, but.
True, but if coin types, I'm guessing, is associating keys with values, there too, I think we'd be doing unnecessary work to convert it into a set. And if I may, I would push back on this, and we were just coincidentally talking about this over email with some of the staff because I was trying to design something involving types just this weekend. And, you know, I actually prefer this on further thought because, one, it would be weird or presumptuous to subclass the list class. I mean, really, that's a primitive type built into the language. You can use it as part of your own class, but it should really be tucked in as an instance variable, I think, not just extended. And two, when I'm writing code, especially for main code like this, like, I don't want you to be able to subclass something necessarily. Like, that's not a feature I want to provide. I don't know if that's going to break my own code. And so I would, at least in cases like this, if I know it should be a list, I would argue that it should be a list no matter what. But I do agree that the code would break, especially down here, for instance, if we enhance player to have its own subtypes, then I'm going to have to go back and do this. So I could be convinced that way there as well.
Yeah. And Ellen1 asked, why not use a try catch block here in reference to the various raise errors?
You could, because the presumption is, I think, later on that it will be taken for granted that players is a list, that player is a player, and just bad things will happen if you try to treat those as they in ways that they are not. This is a downside, I think, of Python in any loosely typed language. In languages like Java and C and C++, you would specify the types of these parameters as the inputs to the function. So the compiler would actually statically be able to tell you yes or no, the type is as you expect, and you wouldn't have to have all of this annoying error checking. And this is a trade-off. I actually think this is an annoying feature of a lot of languages like Python, where you have to or should do this kind of checking if you really want to write defensive code. Or an argument could be made, don't do any of this error checking and just don't write incorrect code that uses incorrect types. I mean, Python is kind of a language for mature adults, if you will, where you should just agree not to miscall things too.
Sure.
I think that's probably a little naive because even I miscall some of my own functions sometimes.
That's their defense for not having or not having a idiom or paradigm for private variables, right?
Yeah,
private fields.
Same idea, just don't do that is generally the advice. So I would love to see a comment or so here. This looks like we're just tucking away some default state, which is fine, but it would be nice to just define this in the constructor, right? Because of all the functions I'm going to care about, the constructor is kind of like a main entry point and giving more there. And I think here I can echo Brian's concern earlier. Don't just hard code some arbitrary string. Instead, treat it as some kind of constant value or an approximation thereof.
We have quite a question from Maybell P2006. Please, please, please. Hello, guys. Nice to see you. Could you help me with this simple question? How can I receive the data in book as a dictionary, not as a simple array? Book ID gets input. I don't know if we maybe want to write it into a thing or whatnot, but.
So this, I presume, is from Web50?
This looks like, yeah, part of a web programming problem set.
So if this is using SQL Alchemy, which is the library via which you can execute SQL queries on a database, dbExecute probably returns some kind of class that's specific to SQL Alchemy. You can probably, if you're storing that in a variable called book, just cast or convert book to a dictionary. And I'm making this up just off the top of my head.
VS Code is installed on here too if you prefer using that.
Well, I'm just going to arbitrarily add it to Samarth's program here.
Okay.
I think you can probably do something like this to convert whatever that structure is to a book.
That should most likely
Dictionary.
work, yeah. You shouldn't necessarily need to do that, though. If all you're trying to do is access the properties of the book, you can probably do something like book.title and book.author already to get at the properties of the book by the looks of that, unless I'm reading it wrong.
And another comment here about YouTube. I'm glad folks are able to tune in via YouTube. It's also on Facebook, though. YouTube probably tends to be the most robust internationally. So by all means, have a couple windows open, watch us there, and comment here.
Yeah, I think they have dynamic encoding to lower resolutions.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Twitch does not.
And realize you can comment on YouTube and Facebook. It's just none of us are looking there right now. We only
Yeah.
have the Twitch comments up.
Yeah, so pull up twitch.tv/CS50TV if you're watching on Facebook and YouTube and comment in there.
Someone mentioned TypeScript. I'm a big fan of TypeScript. If you're unfamiliar, TypeScript is a typed version of JavaScript, and it just makes it really easy to write JavaScript code that is free of potential type errors because it is a strongly typed version of JavaScript. So
Heard good things. Yeah, I should check it out at some point.
All right, well, let's move on shortly, I think, to another project. But overall, I think we're seeing a good amount of commenting. There's still some room for improvement. I think we see some pretty clean code, but some inconsistencies with commenting, capitalization, and with single quotes versus double quotes, and then some actual design opportunities for improvement, things like the state management and actually representing things, and then the main function as well.
Yeah, the game state being stored as a string too, I think echoes back to Brian's prior point about using an enum, or at least your point about using sort of faux enums using static variables. I think we could have done something like not yet began in all caps, and that would have probably been better designed than a string too.
Nice.
Cool.
All right. As an aside, I'm just kind of thinking ahead here. This is kind of interesting because I'm seeing a double negative, so to speak. If it is not the case that input turns equals none, I think what you could do is actually distill that a little more Pythonically as just this, because that will return true if it is anything other than none.
Yeah.
So long as we don't need to distinguish between none and 0, that should work, yeah.
Correct, assuming that's some kind of object input turns. I don't know what data type that's going to be.
Yeah, I don't either.
So it could just be that it was optional. So if it's anything other than what is the default value.
Oh, actually, it looks like it's supposed to be a dict from. Yeah, so that should work fine.
Okay. All right.
Cool. I'll bring us over
All
to
right.
the other screen.
Yeah,
here
you
so
want
we
to say a
can-
couple hellos as we get ready
Oh,
for
sure.
the next one?
Sorry about that, by the way. Whipstreak23, please look at my code. We'll get to you, Nate. Don't worry. I don't know about today, but we have you on the list. Defensive programming is an art to write good Python code. Yeah, it's a pain, though, says Bavik Knight. And Bavik Knight says, thank you, Brian. I will keep that in mind regarding TypeScript.
Funny you mentioned Bavik Knight, because I think we are next up to Tic Tac Toe,
Uh-oh.
which
Here
is his
we
own
go.
application. So Bavik Knight, I do see is in the chat today. So everyone get ready to with your feedback, hopefully very positive as to what we're about to see.
All right, let's do it. First thing I'm noticing, actually, though, I don't think this has a README. Am I mistaken?
This is a directory inside of the CS50 Beyond repository, so maybe CS50 Beyond has a README? I don't know.
As I can see.
It does.
Okay.
Okay, so thanks for the link back to us. We would have liked to see more descriptive information about the project, but that's okay. Let me go back here. So Brian probably knows this best, so I'm a little scared. This is not the guy to ask, I think, for feedback. So here we go. So actually, can I comment on one thing? Don't check into version control your PyCache file folder. So Python, as an interpreted language, typically can do some optimizations underneath the hood, and one is to precompile your code and then save the outputted bytecode, the temporary version of your code for efficiency. This should not end up in version control, and so one way to avoid this, if we go back to the repo, is in this git ignore file. It looks like PyCache.
The issue is the spelling of git ignore.
Oh, yeah, this is spelled.
Wow, I think that would have taken me a little while to figure out, I think. Yes, you must name your git ignore file git ignore and not git ignore. But this is the right line here. And in fact, you don't strictly have to do the star. You can actually just specify tic-tac-toe PyCache. And I think if you only do ___ PyCache __/ that'll get, will that get PyCaches everywhere?
I think it should, yeah.
If you don't have the leading slash.
Count Flopula, you're getting roasted, Kappa, in regarding to
That's
Bavik.
okay. Bavik Knight is a frequent tune-in, so I think we're friends by now. Actually, I think we are on Facebook, so we're cool. All right, should we take a look at Tic Tac Toe?
Yeah, let's take a look.
So, do you want to remind folks what Tic Tac Toe is all about? I mean, can we draw on the screen? Do we know how to draw?
We might have an app. Why don't we switch over to here?
Oh, you know,
first?
I can do it right here.
Oh yeah, draw.cs50.io, and then actually you should be able to just use this pen, right?
Yeah. So why don't we make this a little interactive? Would you play a Tic Tac Toe with me?
You want
Sure,
to test
let's
it?
play.
Just test it and make sure it works
Yeah.
first.
So we have draw.cs50.io.
It's not live. I just want to make sure it works
Oh.
before we. Okay, cool.
Well, now I see. Okay. So here we just hooked up draw.cs50.io, which you're welcome to use too. We use it in classes for drawing on touch screens. And shall we, for those unfamiliar, especially outside the US, what is tic-tac-toe?
Yeah, so Tic-Tac-Toe is a game whereby we're going to have a 3x3 grid that's basically just 9 squares arranged in a 3x3 grid. There are 2 players, a player X and a player O, and they alternate taking turns drawing either an X or an O, whichever one is them, in one of the 9 squares, and the goal is to get 3 in a row. You can get 3 in a row in a vertical line, you can get 3 in a row in a horizontal line, or you can get 3 in a row along a diagonal. And so the goal is to try and get 3 in a row.
And the funny thing is, with Tic-Tac-Toe, the game is such that if you have 2 players playing optimally, let's call it intelligently, no one should ever win this game. So with that in mind, watch me lose now. I think, even though most people start with the center, I think the best strategy is not to do that. And you're smiling, which makes me think you're not going to tell me. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to hope that that was for the best.
Okay,
Although, should I
I'm
run
going
in
to
the corner?
play O in the middle. I'll go, here.
All right. All right, and now again, I don't want to let Brian get 3 O's in a row, and he doesn't want to get me get 3 X's in a row. So now I'm gonna go here, which I'm really liking. That's gonna force his hand because if he doesn't want to lose.
So I have to play in the upper left because that's the only way to block.
And now I'm gonna go. Yeah, I didn't do this right. I have to go here if I don't want to lose now because diagonal is allowed.
Now I'm running into the same problem. I have to play in the lower middle, otherwise he's gonna get 3 in a row.
And now I have to go over here so I don't immediately lose.
And it looks like this game's probably gonna be a tie because now I could choose either one of these places, but I no longer have a.
You could pass.
I could.
You could pass.
I don't know if you're allowed to pass. Go ahead and.
Oh my goodness! And then.
Game's a tie.
We both played optimally.
Kai's Twitch saying you started with the worst possible move.
I don't think so. Case in point. Are you supposed to start with the corner though?
I thought you were supposed to start with one of the corners.
I think the first move I always start with the center. I know you can avoid losing if you start with the center. It's the second move where if the first person plays in the center and the second person plays on the edge, then you can lose.
Yeah, you might not have played optimally.
I might not have played optimally. It's possible.
Brian, let me win, I think is the takeaway.
He's sandbagging.
Or let me not lose.
Yeah. If you're actually interested in sort of the game theory of this,
ask someone else.
Tic Tac Toe is an example of what's called an MNK game, where you're playing on an M by N board until someone gets K in a row. In the example of Tic Tac Toe, M, N, K, and K all happen to be 3. But if you vary what M, N, and K are equal to, you can get different games that have different strategies. So if this is the type of thing that interests you.
Or if you'd like to take all of the fun out for a small child. Explain it that way. All right, so that's what Tic Tac Toe is. Now let's go ahead and take a look at Bavik Knight's implementation thereof, and maybe even some of his cached bytecode here, it would seem. All right, so where you want to start?
All right, so I happen to know that Tic Tac Toe is a Flask-based game with CS50 Beyond. But even if I didn't, there's a file called application.py, which seems like a reasonable place to start.
Not a requirement, but Flask has used this file in like their documentation. Is just the default. You might see server.py or app.py. Other possibilities exist too. All right.
Got a nice little function or a comment block up top, you know?
Yeah, and I'm seeing this shebang up here, this hash bang, which allows us to run this code through Python. And if I scroll down to the bottom, yeah, this came up before. This is actually the older way of doing this with Flask, and I think it's not recommended anymore. So first and foremost, I would get rid of the first line, the shebang, get rid of this line, because all of your application.py should be run as a command line argument these days to a program called Flask. This will still work, but there is some reason that I think is documented as to why they now recommend the other approach. All right, let's go back up to the top here. How would we go about wrapping our minds around this file?
All right, well, let's start by looking at some of the things that are imported. We're importing a whole bunch of things from Flask itself, some things to help this web application run.
Okay.
On line 14, we're importing from Flask Session. It looks like we're going to be using sessions in this application, probably so that we can maintain the state of the game board inside of the application session. And the session technically needs to be stored somewhere, and so here we're importing a function called makeDtemp, or make a temporary directory, which is where we're going to store that session information. And then there's some configuration to get that session
And
set up.
this is actually problematic in some contexts, because if you run Flask in debugging mode, and therefore it restarts after every request, I believe you will get a different temporary directory. We've run into this problem before.
I remember
we
running
used
into
to
this
do
problem before, yeah.
So I think this is actually fine in production code where the server is running for a long time, but if you're using Flask's debugging mode where it's supposed to restart itself after every request, just to give you a clean slate, I believe you will end up seeing your session files end up in different folders on the file system, and therefore you might be losing some of your state. So just FYI, you can probably omit this, and what we have started to do for class purposes is let Flask use the default, which is called Flask_session, then add that to your git ignore file to make sure you don't check it in unnecessarily as well. All right, so here we have a route in Flask. If unfamiliar, this allows you to specify, hey Flask, call the following function anytime the user visits this route. And slash is the default route, presumably. And here we see an index function that for some reason takes an argument. Can you help me figure this out?
Yeah, I'm a little bit uncertain about why that's there. I mean, it probably could be a variable, but I wonder if anywhere index is called, that's a different index.
Function. Yeah, I'm not sure we're using
I'm not sure either. So unless there's some way, just not in this file, to get to index with a different value of n, which, is it possible? I don't know.
I know there could be a URL for, let's say URL,
URL for index doesn't change.
but you could pass in a different value for n.
You could, although generally when you do that in the app.route / you would have another route that would have n as a parameter, so you can actually generate
agreed.
URL for that.
Oh, very true, very true. Yeah, so I think Bavik Knight, this is just not necessary, this argument. You're sort of giving yourself a local variable or a constant of sorts, even though that's not really the right way to do it. So I would probably define that up above somewhere, or because he is using it. It looks like the default size of his board is indeed 3 by 3, but that should be defined probably as a constant or a global variable somewhere else, or in a config file.
I'd say so.
Now, this is really cool, but this is also kind of crazy for those folks who haven't seen this technique. What's going on here?
Yeah, so this is a special feature of Python known as list comprehension, which is just a fancy way of trying to create a list. And so the thing to focus on is first, we're trying to create a board, and the way we're going to represent the board is a list of 3 things, where each thing itself is going to be a row of the board. And so each row is also going to be a list of 3 things. And so each individual row is generated this way. For underscore in range n, might look familiar from like for I in range something that you may have seen in creating a for loop. We're just using an underscore because we don't really need a name for this variable. We don't care about keeping track of what number it is. We just want some loop to run some number of times. And here we're saying basically n times, put none inside of this list. So we end up getting a list that has none 3 times. And then we repeat that process 3 times as well. So the result is that we get 3 rows in a list where each row is a list that contains none 3 times.
I don't remember. Are you able to do it like hold on a second, like times a list by 3 or by n and have that work?
So normally you can. Can we open up a sandbox just to quickly demonstrate something?
For more on CS50 Sandbox, tune in tomorrow for our stream on that.
So you'll run into an interesting problem if you try and do that here. But in short, normally you can. And so if I just go ahead and open up a Python interpreter here, and I define a list called x, which I set to be the number 1, and I say like times 5, for example, what I get is that x is the number 1 repeated 5 times. This is often a strategy that people doing the Mario assignment in Python can use by taking a hashtag and maybe repeating it a number of times. And you could imagine doing this for a list too. If I say x equals, let's say, none, I'm just not going to use the generator for now, say none, none, none times 3, it looks like you get the right result, where x is not, that is not what I wanted.
Oh, it flattened it.
I want none, none, none times 3. Oh, it flattens it. Why does it flatten?
That's weird. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure. I've not had occasion to
Well,
do
let's do none for blank in range 3. Oh, when you multiply a list, it might try to...
You got equals as well.
Oh, yeah. I don't know why it's flattening it. It's actually...
Control A too.
That's weird. That's, yeah. Because I thought you could do it definitely this way, but I didn't actually know in advance that it was going to flatten the list.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make is that if you try and say, like, row is none 3 times, oops, none, 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 and you have a board, I see a lot of people that try and say, like, let's go ahead and add the row to the board and add the row to the board 3 times. And now you have a board that looks like it has none, 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 none. But this isn't quite going to work because if I try and edit one of the cells and say set x to be in the first cell, and I look at the board now, x shows up 3 times in each of the rows.
Yeah.
And so multiplying a list will often do that, where we'll take the list and it will end up just giving you references to the same list as opposed to brand new lists. And so that's the reason
I feel like I've
for
seen
that.
this problem before, but not in this.
That problem can sometimes come up.
I think that's how you cheat in Tic Tac Toe, right?
Just one, x wins.
Okay.
But
all right, should we hop back to the code? Yeah. All right. So this would seem to be initializing the board here. Here we could probably comment just as we did with Samarth's code, where you could maybe use some other kind of symbol. However, I don't know, tic-tac-toe is so simple that it's X and O only. However, you could imagine accidentally doing a lowercase x and a big X, so there's still some risk of bugs there. So I probably would just factor that out with a variable name instead. And you could call the variable X and the other one O, just to keep your life simple, but I think that would be more resilient against bugs. All right, so let's see. As an aside, I'm pretty sure that strictly speaking, you don't need to pass in session board and session turn because your template in Jinja is going to have access to session as a global variable itself. That might save you a little bit of complexity here, even though this makes it more explicit as to what variables you should have access to. We're passing in n as well, but again, we should probably factor that out to a global constant as well. All right, so it looks like there's some reset route, which has to do with resetting the game, maybe after you've lost or you just want to start over. Deleting the session board would seem to delete that key from the session, and then this is just going to redirect the user back to the home page so that he or she can start again. This is kind of cool. For those less familiar with Flask routes, what's this funky syntax in the route doing?
Yeah, so this is a way of creating variables inside of the route. So for instance, if you imagine a website like Twitter, for instance, where you have, if you want to go to someone's Twitter page and you go to twitter.com/CS50, for example, it's not like Twitter, if Twitter were using Flask, it's not like they have a whole bunch of routes where they have one app route for /CS50 and one route for every other Twitter user. What you can do is you can have variables in the route and say if someone goes to, in this example, /play/some integer /some other integer, that's going to result in taking you to this particular function where those parameters inside the route get passed in as variables into the play function. And so that can allow us to generate a whole bunch of play routes for all the different places on the board where you could potentially move, and each one will call this function with different arguments.
If you scooch over this way just a little bit.
More this way?
Yeah.
Oh,
Thanks.
Colton's off camera. Okay.
No, I think I'm.
No, I think just the chat window's a little big too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, do you want me to decrease this? Wait, what do you want to increase?
No, that's fine. That's
Okay.
fine. All right, so, this is a subtle bug, but there is a bug here, it would seem. Suppose that a user had in their autocomplete or their history a URL like /play/something/something. It would seem possible to induce execution of this function, play, even before the session board exists, because the session board, recall, is initialized in the index function. So long story short, there's a subtle bug here whereby if a user starts visiting your website not via index, but somehow or other visits that play route, as by autocomplete or something, you could actually get some kind of server error, a key error most likely, because session is not going to have this variable in there. There's a few ways to deal with this. You could add some error checking at line 42 to make sure the board exists, or you can use something that I've started using in a lot of Flask projects. Let me Google Flask API before first request, I think the function is called. And in this documentation here, let me search for it again, before first request, you can actually implement a function in your own code that allows you to specify, hey Flask, run the following code before any of my other requests, before any of my other routes are handled, thereby ensuring as follows, that this happens. If I go up into a text editor here, and let's do test.py, I believe the syntax for this is this. Def before first request. You can do something like if board not in session. You can go ahead and say session board gets an empty dictionary. And this then ensures that no matter what route in your program is visited, there will be an empty dictionary, if nothing else, at session bracket board.
And is there a reason that's before first request and not just before request? Like, shouldn't we say before every request, make sure that?
So no, I don't think that's necessary, right? Because once the server is running, before every request, first request, yeah, this might not be. Yep, you are right, because this is not user specific, and you want to make sure that every user has a session key for board. So before request ensures that no matter who is visiting, you're going to check to make sure that he or she has in fact a board, even if it's empty, available to them.
Oh, and Bavik Knight has corrected my mistake from earlier. If you wanted to generate the board that way, you would have said put none, none, none inside of the list and then multiply it by 3. That will give you the list of all of them.
Very nice.
And this creates the problem where you can set something equal to x, and x wins automatically because we've updated all of the lists.
So in short, even if you do that correctly, don't do that.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
It's weird that it uses this, recycles the same one, but I guess it makes sense because the comprehension parses it as the same object.
Duplicate that same value.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
You could probably, you could probably use, what is it, a copy or a deep copy if you actually wanted to create a duplicate value.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, so let's go back here. Looks like we're doing some game state. I see a nice use of tuples here. So this game state function presumably is taking as input a row and a column, and then it's returning two variables, which is something you can't really do easily in C. You can kind of sort of do it in Python, even though technically you're returning one value. That value just happens to be a tuple, which is a group of one or two or more values, in this case separated by commas. Here we're checking hopefully a Boolean value, a true or false, and then we're explaining to the user whether or not they are the winner or if it's a tie, and then we're rendering an actual template as such. So I would note a couple things here too. Just trying to make sense of this. Winner dash XO. I'm not sure I understand this.
Oh, I think I see what they're getting. It's a little bit strange, but it seems to me that winner is going to be a number where 0 represents a tie, 1 represents X winning, and 2 represents O winning, is my guess. And what they're doing here is they're printing out the winner by taking the string dash XO and indexing into it to get a particular character. So if winner is 1, then they index into dash XO with 1, and it prints out X as the winner. This is my guess as to what's happening.
I think you're right, yeah.
Okay, and the fact that I had to think so hard about that, it seems like this is too clever, right? It would seem that rather than return a value like 0, 1, 2, you should probably just return X or O or variables representing them, or maybe none to represent that third state of like, no, there is no winner just yet. And I would also propose that you have this string being constructed here in your controller code, in your route, or this string here being constructed instead. Honestly, in the spirit of MVC, Model View Controller, that kind of logic probably belongs in the template itself. So in final.html, you're checking the value of a variable passed in, whether it's a winner variable or some other such variable. Don't construct the string in your controller, construct it instead in your view. Among the benefits here is you keep a cleaner separation of your code's logic and your aesthetics design. You can also internationalize or change the language more easily in your templates without touching any of your logic, your controller code. So I would keep that in mind. And honestly, you know, clever though this is, I think this is too clever for its own good.
And Bevig did confirm Brian was correct.
Yeah, I'll be curious, Bavig, if you'd like to chime in why you did it that way, because I'm not sure I would even have thought to do it that way when you could just return a dash, an X, or an O. Feel free to chime in here to push back. But some nice use of ternary stuff here, where you're actually setting a variable equal to this or that based on some condition. It's a little different in C and in Java, where you use the question mark and the colon, but this is Python's closest equivalent. Good use of redirection. Here's the game state, really nice documentation. There's that tuple that we inferred from the calling convention earlier. So no complaints there, to be honest. Really good commenting overall. Anything jump out at you that's of concern?
If you take the suggestion that we originally suggested, which is move n as to a global variable, then line 66 stops becoming necessary. You don't need to take the length of the grid to recompute n.
And how come he's doing this? I thought you had to indent everything in a line of its own in Python.
If it's just a single line as the body of the if statement, you can put it on the same line as he's done there.
Very nice. And is that good or bad, do you think?
In this case, I would say it's probably might even be a little bit clearer to put something on the next line just to make it easier to read. I've seen it all on the same line when there's like a lot of very quick if, else if, else ifs, where it might make sense to put everything and put it under the same line. I don't think it's necessary here, though.
Yeah, but no, I think no strong feelings on my part. Although we're seeing it again and again. Although now we're seeing a counter example. So, a counter example. Wow, that was unintentional. Thank you very much. I would probably put this one at least on the same line as well for the same reasons.
Yeah,
all right.
Agreed.
All right, isOne function presumably returns... Oh, so that's interesting, and I'm not sure I'm loving this. The function is called isOne, but it doesn't return a Boolean, a true or false. It returns a tuple containing a Boolean as well as that int, which is probably that index 0, 1, or 2. Here feels like an opportunity to name the function not isOne, but who won or winner, and allow it to pass back some value, such as we described earlier.
Yeah, or get win data, something that's more verbose.
And something like this too. I mean, this is getting too, I think, cryptic for its own good. Like tot, which is probably total. I wouldn't start saving characters now when you've just had a whole paragraph of explanation. I don't know why it's -1 initially or why we're initializing it to the length. I think Bavig, this is just starting to get unnecessarily complicated, and it might be correct and work, but you're making a third-party reader, a collaborator, just think too hard about what's going on for a relatively simple goal too. All right. And oh my goodness, now this is just getting so crazy. It looks like we're doing return false none if total mod n. So if that is an odd number, it seems.
Not even if it's
What is
not
n
a
again?
multiple of 3. N is 3.
Oh yeah, because n can take on those several values.
I don't really know what total is doing.
Yeah.
We're taking, for Ian check, I don't know what check is. Check is a list?
I think don't make your reader think this hard, especially for something that is pretty straightforward. You're just trying to return X or O or no one won the game. All right, should we take a look at maybe one other file?
Babak was saying I wanted to use enum for that, so only one of the result I could output.
That's true, but again, I would propose some kind of ternary variable where you're either returning X or O or neither, namely none or some such value.
Akash says, how do we get to know if and when our code will be reviewed? Thanks. Some folks have asked to be notified and they sent them an email, but let us know if you want us to email you and we can let you know in advance.
Should we take a look at one of the templates?
Yeah, it looks like there was only, let's look at game.py.
Looks like there were only 3. Okay, game.html.
Yeah, so it's extending layout, but layout probably just contains some of the default HTML for the page. So the interesting stuff is probably inside of game.html.
Yeah, looks like we're rendering the game's board as a table, which is a pretty reasonable use of a table. Looks like there's a link to actually play the game, which uses URL4. If unfamiliar, URL4 is a nice way to dynamically get the correct route for a particular function that you want to call, and it does it in a way where you don't have to hard code this, because you could imagine very easily doing something like this, where down in your code you don't say URL4, but you instead say /play, /play / curly brace I / curly brace J. So you could construct this URL manually. The downside of that is that if you rename that route over in your application.py, this breaks, and that's a little fragile, I would say. But frankly, we do this sometimes in CS50, at least in that first project like CS50 Finance. It's just so much more understandable. So I think Babak Knight, I think you've done a good job and the right approach here. We just tend not to do this in class because it just feels like too much too soon sometimes. Any concerns, really?
Actually, this looks pretty good.
Pretty clean, yeah.
Yeah, let's take a quick look at the layout and then maybe move on to another project.
Sure.
All right, let's go back. Layout.html, for those unfamiliar, in Flask, this web framework, it's a common paradigm to have a layout.html, which gives you the overall structure for a page, and then smaller templates that inherit from it to fill in other blanks. Not much here. Strictly speaking, in HTML5, which Babak Knight is indeed using per this doc type, you no longer need to specify a type. CSS is going to be inferred. You also don't need to close this tag. You're welcome to. It's a remnant of what's called XHTML, or it's also valid in HTML, but no one really does it anymore. It's just not necessary. In here, minor point, you don't really need separate lines there. I would just pull the end block onto the same line, but there's really no downside other than an extra few white spaces that you'll see in your file. Cool. All right, well, really nicely done, Babak Knight, and nice use of CS50 Beyond. Feel free to tune in to CS50 Beyond's videos online if you'd like to take a look at that as well.
All right, you want me to bring us over?
Yeah, let's toggle
to
over. You want to say a few hellos and catch up, and
Sure.
we'll see what else we got going on.
I'm keeping up pretty well with the chat, actually, thankfully.
Sure.
Have we done enough here before?
We have,
Okay.
yeah. So
You wanna go right here?
yeah, if we want to, this was the next one. I kind of put them in sequence relative to to the languages.
How
Are
about
kind of,
this one, though?
You want to do that one?
Yeah, because we keep mentioning Java.
Okay,
Maybe we'll
sure.
take a look at
Let's
that
do
one?
that one. Yeah.
All right. All right, we're going to take a look at a Java application. This
Okay.
looks like this is from a student.
The actual name is on the other thing. If you want to tab back
Let's
over.
see. Let's
Krishna Srizamapali.
All right, Krishna. All right. So here we have a looks like something related to a something related to a course on information security, 2-semester course. And we have a whole bunch of implementations, it would seem, of ciphers. So this is great, since this code should, of course, be perfectly correct. So please rely on us for this. Should we start with maybe something, a little warm-up exercise, maybe some arithmetic?
Let's take a look at arithmetic.java.
All
and see
right,
what's in there.
so let's weigh in on your arithmetic. Oh my goodness, I was hoping for addition and subtraction. All right, so here we have a class called arithmetic, necessary in Java because everything has to be a class. Here, I do think we can make some comments on style. Like, I'm not quite sure why this is indented. Looks like some tabs there. Oh, now I'm seeing spaces. All right, so without getting into the weeds of tabs versus spaces, do not use both would be one takeaway. And I'm seeing that this is a tab because the whole thing gets highlighted in GitHub here. Other comments, this is partly user choice, but I mean, I find it less readable when you're not using any white spaces in between your operators. However, this is perhaps personal preference here. Java hasn't really standardized these details as much as, say, Python has, if that sounds right.
It looks like they're not being super consistent between whether to keep variable names uppercase or lowercase. I imagine the convention in most languages is kind of what's being done in line 19, which is lowercase variable names in the function.
For sure.
But mod inverse and mod both have uppercase A and uppercase C.
Yeah, though, to be fair, if the student were given a formula, say, in a textbook or in the problem statement using capital letters, I might push back and say, well, I'm just trying to be consistent.
That makes sense.
So it looks like this is implementing modular arithmetic, a mod C, which is effectively the remainder operation, though not 100% of the time, but we're seeing, especially when you have negative values, which the student is accounting for here, it would seem. They're ensuring that it becomes positive so as to then just use the built-in modulo operator.
I think there are probably more efficient ways to do this if A is a really big negative number and C is a small number. You're going to end up running this loop a lot of times, and you'll probably be a little bit smarter about that logic. But,
yeah, because it looks like you've just made what could be probably a close to constant time operation linear now in the size of the input. Mod inverse, and it's nice that we do have definitions here because otherwise it would be less obvious what the code is supposed to be doing. I'm not sure we should necessarily get into the weeds since this is just the first of many files of all of the correctness here, but maybe we can pull out some salient characteristics stylistically in design. Indentation seems to have taken a turn here now that we're indenting by one space and then two spaces, so I would be consistent there. It's just starting to get a little sloppy, and honestly, this is starting to get really hard to read without spaces. I think exploding this a little more, certainly giving me some spaces around the mod operator. Maybe not here, because then I can kind of think of this as a single argument, but again, you could argue this both ways. So
yeah, I think I'd like to definitely see more spaces.
Now this is interesting. It looks like XOR here is taking as input actual string representations or char representations of bits, which is okay, and maybe that was the problem statement. But what can we glean here? This is interesting in Java. When something goes wrong, you can throw a particular type of exception. However, I see this only happening down here. If A equals 1, what is going on here?
I see what's going on. Line 27 is checking to make sure that both A and B are either the character 0 or the character 1. If so, we return.
Sure.
Otherwise, we'd only ever hit line 33 if either one or the other character wasn't a 0 or 1. So if A is a 0 or 1, then B has to be the character that's not represented correctly. Otherwise, A.
Oh, that's kind of clever, but you have to think about it. Is there some other way to express that more succinctly? I guess not. It's just sort of logically correct.
Yeah.
However, if you wanted to specify, well, you could just very easily check if A does not equal 0 or 1, throw a binary representation of A. Otherwise, do the same thing for B and do the same check. I mean, frankly, I would prefer that. Just like tell me what you're doing as opposed to doing it a little more cleverly like this, because we've already spent 10 seconds talking about it when we would have spent 0, I think, if it were just a little more pedantic. Yeah. All right, greatest common denominator, GCD seems to be next. This is finding the largest value that is common to both as a factor.
I like this a lot. This is using Euclid's algorithm for calculating the greatest common denominator, which is a very nice recursive algorithm for doing this. It's calling itself on a smaller problem each time.
Now, should we be citing Euclid if this is his work and not ours?
I would actually recommend putting a comment in here. I think it is non-obvious if you haven't seen this way of calculating the greatest common denominator before, what exactly is going on, why are you switching the arguments of A and B to B and A on line 41. So explaining that in a comment is probably helpful for someone reading the function for the first time.
Now, does Euclid have a GitHub repo, maybe where this came from?
I don't think he has an account.
No? Okay. All right, is prime. This is an interesting one, and this is kind of a challenge in many domains to determine if something is prime efficiently. How are we doing this here? Looks like we're quickly checking if it's 0 or negative. We're checking if it's pretty easy, if it's the value 1, 2, or 3. So we're kind of special casing a few of these, or 2 and 3. And then here we're doing a bit of math. What do you think is the gist here?
Okay, the comment kind of explains it. Every prime number other than 2 or 3 is of the form 6k plus 1 or 6k minus 1. And so they're just going over all possible k's.
Is that true?
Interesting.
I think
like,
that's true.
Like 11 would be
12 minus 1.
Yep, and then like 13 would be 12 plus
It might be a
1.
number theory thing that just is true.
Yeah.
I haven't heard of it myself, but
No, I don't think that's true. There's no known gaps, predictable gaps between the prime numbers, right? Because is prime was only determined to be in polynomial.
well,
form.
they're not saying that every 6k plus 1 or 6k minus 1 is a prime number. They're saying that if it's a prime number, then it is of this form, which means there could be larger gaps, but when you get to a prime number, it's of the form. I don't actually know if it's true, but
Let me just Google something real quick. Primes is in P. There's a paper just some years ago. Primes is in P. Let's see. Yeah, so I don't think that can be the case because this would not be such a seminal work. If it determines in polynomial time if a number is prime.
Well, this algorithm is not going to be. This is going to be a long algorithm because it's going to iterate over all the possibilities and calculate the mod for each one.
But given a prime, you could certainly figure out minus 1 and then divide by 6 or add 1 and subtract 6. So
actually,
I don't
you're right,
think
you're
this
right.
is right.
I'd have to think about it a little more.
To verify the prime, and that's what the whole primes algorithm is. Whoops.
Can we just look up
already.
like prime 6k plus 1? I'm kind of curious.
It'd be hilarious if it was that easy. And no,
No,
one
well,
necessarily
actually,
figured it
you
out.
wouldn't be able to tell for sure because you can represent a number as 6k plus 1, but that doesn't tell you it's prime.
Yeah.
So
Oh, I see.
a
what
number
you're
could
saying.
still be equal
yes.
to 6k
okay,
plus 1.
but
not.
this function, though, aspires to tell you if something is prime.
And it's doing that just by testing all the possible k's.
Oh, I see. I see.
So it's not
finding a K.
efficient, but it
Yes,
will
okay.
just iterate over all the possibilities.
That's interesting. You know, I don't know if I ever learned this little
I don't know if I
heuristic.
did either.
But it does, in fact, show up in 216,000 Google results. A prime number cannot be.
Is every prime number of the form 6k plus or minus 1? Yeah, so all prime numbers have to be. That's interesting.
That's fascinating. For more on this, check out Quora.com. I should have encountered this already. Anyhow. All right, so we take a look at some actual code. All right, so that's it for arithmetic. Why don't we take a look at Caesar cipher, then maybe one other, just
Sure.
so that we don't get too far out of at least my comfort zone with the implementations of these.
And really quick, question for David. I have seen an old course of his, CS164, where Laravel was taught. Can I get into Laravel with just completing CS50, MIT 6.0.1x, and CS50? 6.0.2x. I did CS50 when PHP was the language taught in CS.
But yeah, you don't really need any of those other courses. I think back when we taught PHP, you learned enough of the fundamentals that you could then next dive into Laravel. We didn't talk much about object-oriented programming in CS50 back then or now, but which Laravel does rather assume. But I definitely think you are overqualified to go off and learn a framework like Laravel. It's a wonderfully accessible PHP framework for making web programming easier. So a Caesar cipher, for those unfamiliar, should we perhaps just do a quick example here?
Sure, let's do an example.
All right, so Caesar cipher. So suppose that you want to send a message secretly from one person to another. Ideally, you'd want to encrypt it or scramble it in some way, but you want to scramble it deterministically in a way that the recipient can reverse, and that is cryptography or encryption.
Yep, so the way you might encrypt something using the Caesar cipher, it's a cipher that works on alphabetic characters. And what we'll give you is a key, some value generally represented as the letter K, which is how many characters to shift each of the letters in what we're going to call the plain text by. So if we wanted to encrypt the word hello with a key of, let's say, like K equals 2, then I'm going to take each letter and just shift it forward in the alphabet by 2 letters. So H goes to I and then J, E, after E comes F and then G, L comes M and then N, O is P and then Q. So assuming I know my alphabet right, J, G, N, N, Q would be the encryption of the word hello with a value for the key of 2. And then
Otherwise known as the ciphertext.
the ciphertext, exactly. And then I send this message, JGNNQ, over some channel to the person who I want to receive the message. And if they also know the key, K equals 2, what they would do is they would do the reverse of what I did. I move forward in the alphabet by 2 characters, and so they'll go backwards by 2 characters, taking J, going backwards to JK.
Just kidding.
Nope, that's my message to you.
Oh, so I received this message,
Oh,
JK,
yeah.
and the key is 2, so I'm going to go backwards in the alphabet. 2 letters before J is H.
Did you plan this in advance so that you? We got issues on the bottom of the screen.
Oh, okay.
Just draw 50.
I'll just go to H, and after 2 before K is I, so I've been able to decrypt the message, going from the ciphertext back to the plain text by going backwards by 2.
You orchestrated that.
Yeah, just kidding. That wasn't encryption. But that's actually one of the points, too. If you don't know the key in advance, you might decrypt something to text you think it is, but unless you know the key for sure, like K equals 2, it's only with some probability that you've decrypted it properly. Any questions that have popped up here? So why is hashing and cryptography? I feel like there's a whole conversation going on without us.
Yeah, there are some folks. Yeah, I think the one question, or at least the last tie to that was the duck saying most crypto algorithms don't need real primes, just co-primes. I think RSA didn't need real primes too. Not sure.
I think RSA does need real primes in order to work right. I could be wrong about that.
There's an RSA module in.
There is. We can take a look in a moment. So the Caesar cipher is just that. It's a rotational cipher where you're effectively rotating every character by 0 or more places. So I see some interesting features of Java here. Or what is a string builder? I don't see this. What is a string builder?
I've never actually.
The string builder just lets you, I believe, concatenate strings just kind of over and over again. It's just a place to hold it.
Hey, what do you know? Java has that now. Back in my day, we built strings manually.
This has been
from
around
arrays.
for a while. 1.5. That's like, I think like 2002.
That's Java 5 though, because they renumbered. All right. Anyhow, so here we have the string builder class, of course, via which you can concatenate on additional characters pretty efficiently. So what are we doing here? So it looks like if the character is uppercase, we're going ahead and subtracting off from it the number 65. Here, and I'm pretty sure you can do this in Java just as you can in C, I probably wouldn't hard code the value 65 there. I would change that instead to actually doing something like quote unquote A for a capital A. And if you want to be an explicit cast, just so you know what's going on, even though I don't think this should be necessary in Java, you can explicitly cast the A to the corresponding Unicode or ASCII number.
Yeah, I think chars are, that you can use them in the same way as C.
This actually seems like a bug because it's not the case that if something is not uppercase, that it is lowercase. This would seem to be mutating even punctuation characters.
Oh, true, yeah.
And so I'm not loving this. This should really be an else if is lowercase char key so that you're not mutating punctuation characters, which you should not be because otherwise you're rotating all of the characters instead of just those according to Caesar, which would rotate the letters.
This isn't even doing the rotation yet, though. This is just calculating how much to do the rotation by.
Oh, so there could be...
They're assuming that char key is going to be
a
character that's uppercase or lowercase, I guess, which you might want to check for as a matter of error checking, which could be a good thing to do.
I'm not sure I see that anywhere down here because we're again just checking for uppercase.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, they make that's the same mistake. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so I think, and that's fine because if this were done for like a homework assignment or for a textbook, it might have been prescribed that write a function that takes as input an alphabetical string,
right.
In which case this is perhaps okay to assume. All right, so let's go ahead here, or that the char key at least is a numeric number. Or rather,
Adamantine
an alphabetical number.
String builder lets you build a string.
Yeah, that's what we've gleaned as well. All right, so what are we doing here? It looks like, yeah, I think same comments as before. This is just a lot to unpack visually. It just seems like it's getting a little messy, and I have to now really look closely as to what's being subtracted and added, so that can just be cleaned up a little bit. Here's where we're using the string builder class, of course, which allows you to append characters to it. Although, is there any upside to doing it with string builder as opposed to just appending to a string object?
I've seen it used in the context of streams, but I don't think in the context of just this where you could easily substitute it with like concatenation with the plus. I don't think there's any real...
I'm trying to remember in Java, if you just concatenate on a character to an existing string, you probably create a new string object in memory, which is arguably less efficient.
Yeah, that's true. A string builder would probably be for very large bodies of text more efficient because it probably has an internal buffer that's not necessarily reallocated.
Okay. All right. So this is really just a nice vector class that we're getting, but specialized for strings.
Yeah.
All right. So very nice.
Looking ahead a little bit, the thing that I will comment on as a design decision is they have encrypt and decrypt as these two different functions, of which the vast majority of these two functions are identical. The only thing that's different about encrypting and decrypting in the Caesar cipher are these lines on line 20 and line 23, where you're actually moving the character forward by a certain number of characters or moving it back. So this seems like an opportunity to potentially abstract a little bit in order to combine the common functionality into a single function in order to minimize the repeated code.
Sure, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, because you could imagine just having a generic helper function that either rotates things in a positive direction or a negative direction.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that as well. All right, should we take a look at one more, perhaps? I heard RSA mentioned, so Brian will take this one since I did Caesar. So RSA is actually one of the earliest, most popular examples of a public key cryptography system. It supports what's called public key cryptography, or public keys and private keys, which are asymmetric. So if Brian wanted to send me a message encrypted, he would use my public key and encrypt his message with it. I would then use my corresponding private key to then decrypt that message. This is distinct from Caesar, where both of us use the same K, or the same key value. Here we have asymmetric keys.
I almost feel like we've come full circle today. I feel like
Indeed, we just talked about this in
Yeah.
a class on campus this morning, in fact. So RSA is also noteworthy because, you know what? Notice how GitHub right now is using HTTPS. And if I go ahead and pull up my developer tools and go to my security tab and click on view certificates,
Oh, this looks
go ahead
familiar.
and center this. Let's go ahead and look at the details. And voila, I can't really zoom in very clearly here, but you might see some mention of RSA as well as SHA-256, which is a hash function that I think was mentioned in the chat just a moment ago. Our browsers today are doing this because, after all, if you go to github.com via HTTPS for secure connection, an encrypted connection, you probably don't know anyone, a human at GitHub, with whom you could prearrange a key like the number 2. So your browser has to be able to talk to a remote server, GitHub's, without knowing in advance anything about it. So public key crypto lets us do this. My browser will use GitHub's public key in order to establish that secure connection.
Someone was asking, N4NJU says, I never seem to understand how SSL certificates work. I don't know if there's a 2-minute distillation that you...
Yeah, well, maybe let's come back to that once we've looked at this particular algorithm for just a moment here. And the fundamental premise to know with RSA is that the entire security of the system is built on the assumption that if you take two really big prime numbers, multiply them together, you of course get an even bigger number. And the assumption in the mathematical world is that it's really hard and really time consuming to figure out, given that big product, what the original prime numbers actually were. You can absolutely do it. It's just a for loop or a while loop, but it takes so long because these numbers are so big, more time than the bad guys, the adversaries out there, presumably have time for, or computer computational abilities. So should we just take a look at this and maybe draw out some of the features of RSA and the style, even if we don't get into the guts of the algorithm?
Yeah, sure. So it seems like the first function they're defining here are generate keys, which take as its arguments 3 variables, p, q, and e. Conventionally, p and q in RSA refer to those 2 big prime numbers that David was referring to. These 2 big numbers that we're going to have to choose 2 prime numbers. Those 2 numbers are effectively going to be the private key, the thing that we keep secret. Those eventually are going to get multiplied together, and the multiplied result is going to become part of the public key, the thing that we're going to distribute to anyone who wants to send information to us via RSA.
I'm thrilled that everything I just said is borne out in code here.
Yep, we're multiplying it together. So what you'll notice on line 2 is the function is documenting what it is that it returns. The public key in RSA is this pair of numbers d and n. N is the product of the 2 prime numbers, and d is just some other parameter. I forget exactly how it's computed, but I guess we'll see in just a moment.
Probably don't want to return the private key to whoever's using this.
Right, we don't want to return the private key. So it looks
there's
like
that is prime function. I'm glad
Yep.
we took a look at that now.
checking to make sure that p and q are actually prime numbers, otherwise this algorithm isn't going to work.
I do like how the library started referencing its own modules to do more sophisticated stuff.
Yeah, and actually this is an interesting convention. Notice that is prime, we didn't draw attention to this earlier, is what kind of function would you infer from this syntax? Because arithmetic is a class, so this isn't an object.
It's a static function.
Yeah, so you can have these sort of helper functions that are sort of grouped in a class, even though you're not really using the class for class purposes per se. So here's some use of the greatest common denominator function, which we looked at briefly as well. Here's a calculation of d according to RSA's algorithm. And then lastly, we're just returning actually all 3 values, d, e, and n. So that comment up top wasn't strictly thorough, as we see here. And then the encrypt function seems to take in as inputs 3 different inputs here. And then we'll go ahead and what are we doing here? Plain text length. So we're initializing an array that's at the identical size to the plain text, which is interesting. Let's see what's going
Are
on
they
here.
performing math on each individual character?
Yeah,
So-
they're going 1 character at a time through the plain
Yeah.
text and taking its exponent multiplied by exponent raised to the nth power, where n is that parameter from before, the part of the public key. So they're using the public key to generate these really big characters in order to return the cipher, which might not actually be totally secure, this method of encryption.
Yeah, is
it
that
seems
how
like
it's usually used on internet?
generally not, because if you do this, then you could just take a character, encrypt it using the public key, and you could figure out what the public
You're supposed
key
to generally
encryption of
do
it
this
is.
on the entire text, I believe.
So this is probably not the most, this is likely not the most secure way to actually encrypt using RSA.
It was not RSA that was developed by the NSA, that was SHA, right? And the RSA was developed by MIT.
Shaw, that sounds right. Yeah, RSA is 3 faculty from, I think all of whom were from MIT at the time.
Okay.
Or at least Ron Rivest was, who was the R in RSA.
Gotcha.
All right.
They do that a lot in CS, and we were just talking about this earlier, AWK with Brian Kernighan, the Unix utility.
Yeah, no, people name things after. So we're going to see a Colton cipher someday?
Oh, yeah, maybe.
All right. Little Rot 26 maybe?
Yeah. RSA is pretty simple mathematics. You can do it in 4 lines of math, says the duck, though.
Or 41 lines of Java.
And did you want to talk about SSL certificates real quick?
Oh, yeah. So
If it's easy to put down.
In a nutshell, when you visit github.com or amazon.com or gmail.com, and those sites use HTTPS, that means they've been configured for SSL, or a protocol called TLS, whereby they generate, the very first time the software for the web server is installed, a public key and a private key. And they generate a certificate for themselves, which is essentially the public key and some other information. They then ask a third-party company like VeriSign or GoDaddy or Let's Encrypt out there, either for some cost or these days for free, to digitally sign that SSL certificate, their public key, essentially testifying to the fact that, yes, this is github.com's public key, or yes, this is amazon.com's public key, or your own domain name. When Brian or my laptop visit Amazon or GitHub or whatever website, that their server presents to me that certificate, and with it its public key. My browser on my Mac or PC or phone uses that public key to encrypt my first message to them, and from there can we begin to establish a secure connection. And there's a few more steps in there, but the SSL certificate is important in that it, 1, involves that public-private key pair, and 2, it's digitally signed by someone else. Otherwise, you get a scary-looking message on the browser saying that the website you visited might not be secure because this certificate is invalid.
Can you see on a given certificate through the developer tools the actual key itself? Is that visible?
I don't believe so. I'm sure we could find some tool via which to do that, but if I go to security, what we can see is this. If I go back to view certificate, you can see some details about it. So this is the one for github.com. You can see who the certificate authority was, DigiCert being the company here. You can see that the certificate's good for another 1.5 years or so. And if I go to the details, you'll see a whole bunch of information. Serial number is not the same thing as the public key.
There's public
but
key.
it just says RSA.
Oh, there it is.
That is.
You can get
Okay,
the whole
cool.
thing in Chrome, it seems.
Nice.
So we can copy this to a file, and you can actually use this manually. And okay, there's this whole certificate export wizard. Yes, you can see the key. It would be problematic if you could see the private key, of
You
course.
could use it if you're writing like a CLI application that needed to use
Yeah, absolutely.
public key cryptography or whatever.
Yep, indeed.
Cool. That's interesting.
All right, so we're coming up on the end. Should we have still a few minutes. Should we pull up at least one more project, but just do a quick look at it?
Yeah. Why don't we do that? Let's,
All right, do you want
let
to
me go
switch
ahead
over?
and switch this over?
Anything to catch up on in the chat?
Let me just make sure we didn't miss anything. So curve 25519 is the better option, the duck though was saying, better than NISTECC.
Sure, if you want.
I am
That's
not
the person
sure.
we did already. Right?
All right, let's do it. Let's squeeze this in because we have a few minutes.
Okay, sure. So we'll pull up Whipstreak's other project. I know he's been asking.
All right,
us to
get
do the second
excited. We
one.
only have a few minutes, so we'll try to be as constructive as we can, real quick.
I actually downloaded this one in advance, so we can actually execute it and run it if you wanted to look at it. But it's in the downloads folder.
Oh, okay. Oh, to look at the site itself?
Yeah. So let me go ahead and
Alright.
switch so that we can be 100% sure. It is this one. Yep. This is the zip. It's actually in the downloads folder. Go to the downloads right here. Yeah, the folder. Yeah. Okay. Oh, they just have a weird text
that's
box
whatever.
there for some reason.
All right, but do we
and
want to
you
look
can
at
right click and go to index. So NTM, and then right click open with Chrome. Cool. All right. Let me go ahead and switch us back to the computer here.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, interesting. So we've just opened up a file called ntm.html. They offer some very useful tools for 10 kisses a day. Okay. So we see uList, which is another file, and uLinks. Let's take a look at another one here. uLinks seems to be using a nice tabbed interface. Okay, so this is some interesting stuff here. Different colors, maybe some Bootstrap or some other such library. So why don't we take a look at links.html as well as at ntm.html.
Sure.
All right, that first one's ntm.html.
And actually, the calculator one, if you go back to the NTM, I did like his calculator one. Just go back one more. And then my calc, or ucalc at the very bottom. This is kind of cool.
Oh my goodness.
Nice.
This thing's escalated quickly here. All right, 12 plus 3 equals 15. Very nice. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look. Here is ntm.html. I'm seeing HTML5 as per the doc type. Nice mention that this is in English, which helps browsers like Chrome auto-translate from one language to another, so that's good to have as well. It'd be nice to see some indentation, honestly. Now, once we're this far in, we should start indenting things. 2 spaces, 4 spaces, something like that.
It's interesting because I actually see this a lot in code all over the place. The sort of left align, and I don't like it either. I think it should definitely be indented. But I wonder if it's conventional in certain domains to indeed have everything left aligned.
I'm going to say no.
Okay.
In all contexts, this is less readable.
Yeah, it's weird. It's just weird that I see it all the time. From like really readable code too. I forget. I've seen some like big repos that have it.
I don't see any reason to do this.
I don't either. I'm
indent
just
it,
curious
yeah.
why people do it that way.
For the actual style content, I would say it looks like the entire page was just centered from what I remember before.
It looks like it.
Rather than styling each individual tag, maybe just saying body text align center might be a cleaner way of just centering everything.
And normally in CS50, we preach not putting your CSS inside of a style tag to instead put it into a file. But honestly, this page is so relatively short, I'm perfectly comfortable with there being so relatively little CSS in the file itself. Indentation aside. Agreed with Brian on the need for all of those properties. This is horrible. Never do this. And I used to do this too back in the day when HTML was even less featureful. If you wanted multiple line breaks, you hit BR, 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 BR. This is the opportunity for CSS and to actually use a margin top or a padding top to specify however much white space that you want above it. So this is really my only qualm structurally. Don't do this. And you should have known this the moment you started copying and pasting BR again and again and again. Odds are that was the beginning.
I think
of the
he's
problem.
only 10. He's only 10. We got to take it a little.
I think I see 10 BR tags here
Yeah.
though. So indeed. So I think it looks great overall, except for that one detail and the factorization you could do with the CSS.
Do you want to get the calculator real fast with our last
for
remaining
sure.
time?
All right, let's go look at the calculator, calc.html. All right.
So this one's cool because it actually has some JavaScript in it, but in an interesting way.
All right, so let's scroll down to the HTML. And I often do this. If I do see a lot of CSS, I don't care about the aesthetics yet. I care about the structure, so I'll just kind of scroll through all of that. And honestly, we're kind of at the point now where maybe that belongs in a separate file. However, if this is just a set of HTML examples, frankly, maybe they should be standalone and just all in one file. So I'll comment here as well. I think we can improve that. But this is interesting. So do you want to kind of walk us through what you're seeing here?
Yeah, sure. So it looks like they've decided to represent the calculator as an HTML table, which makes sense because we've got rows and columns here. And if we look, we see the first row here is going to be the place at the top of the calculator where you're seeing the result. And so here they have TD, which stands for table data, like a data cell, where call span is equal to 4. This is a way of making a table cell take up multiple cells worth of space on the table, where we want the thing at the top of the calculator to take up more space than any of the individual buttons. So in this case, we're making it take up that whole space. And that looks like just an input field that's disabled because we don't want the user to actually be able to type numbers in. You want them to click the buttons instead. Looks like they have a whole bunch of buttons, one for each of the possible values. And all right, they have some JavaScript in line with the input field. So when you, So for each of these buttons, when you click on the button, this on-click event listener is going to get triggered. So we're going to run this JavaScript anytime you click the plus button. And it seems what they're doing here is just adding to calculator.display.value, which I'm assuming is this input field, and it's just tacking on the plus to that.
And I would make one note here. Disabled is fine. However, I don't know how that's going to behave on all browsers. Read only is probably, well, you can probably still edit it. You can edit it in JavaScript. I would probably change it to read only. I'd have to Google to understand this. So disabled means in the context of forms that get submitted to a server, it will not even be submitted. Now that's inapplicable here because we're keeping everything client-side. I would have to read on the differences subtly between read-only and disabled. I just worry that disabled might be too strong of a property for some browsers. Just a thought. So I think we can clean this up too. I don't mind this for like a first version of a calculator that we just have the logic inside of the file itself. But honestly, there's so much redundancy here that among the ideas I have are this. Let me go ahead and copy just my number 1 here and go into CS50 Sandbox. And let me just paste that there so we know, so we have something to look at. What you could also do is instead a version like this, we could get rid of a lot of this complexity. And we could, for instance, just say something like update this. And if you have a function now elsewhere in your code in a script tag down here, you could imagine doing something like this, function update input. And what you could then do is calculator, let's see, calculator is display. Where was calculator defined?
That's what I was trying to look for before. I didn't see it. I wonder if it's defined
it's
lower
the form.
down.
No, it's right there.
Oh, okay.
It's the form. So this is an old school way of accessing properties inside of a form. So if I go into calculator.display.value, I can still do plus equals, and then I can do this. And I'm trying to remember. I think it's this dot value will actually give me, oh sorry, not this, input dot value will give me the value of that variable.
I think that should work.
I'm pretty sure this would work. I'd have to double check because I'm doing this off the top of my head. But the upside of this update function is now you don't have to hard code all of the logic into this string. You can do something even more succinctly just by updating and passing in this, which is a reference to that local input element. Or frankly, we could do this even more abstractly. We could factor that out, and elsewhere in my script tag could I do something like this, document.querySelector. And then I can select all of the input elements if this is what I want to do, but this is probably too many. But I could do something like this, query selector input, and then what do I want to do on click?
You would probably have to do query selector all to get all of them.
And can you, oh, then we have to iterate over it as a loop.
Yeah, so you could do it. It would just mean query selector all.
Can we do this?
Each goes after input.
Oh yeah, sorry, getting ahead of myself.
And then it's for each, capital E.
Dot for each, and then that gets passed in what, an input reference to the element itself.
Yeah. So you do input
for each function
taking the input, and then it's the same as the contents of the function from before.
Okay, so let's close this, and now down here we can do something like this. However, what I don't love about this is, and I'm just going to make a to-do to myself, ensure this only works for certain inputs. Because I think some of these inputs are special. We had an equal sign, we had a clear button.
Yep.
So what we might want to do is actually add a class or a data property to only those numbers. And frankly, at that point, what you can do is this. Instead of using value, which strictly speaking should be used for the value of an element to a form, and buttons typically, they can have values, but it's not something you would generally mutate. You could actually do something like this. Data value equals 1, and data dash anything is a way of defining a custom HTML attribute on an element. So you could put data value only on the numeric buttons, for instance, and you can use other types of attributes for like your special buttons as well.
That makes sense. There's an interesting bug that I noticed with this program too, because all of the behavior is such that it just plus equals something to the display, including the operators. So for example, plus.
So you can press plus twice or something?
You can do plus as many times as you want, and then all that equals does is just an eval right there. So if you try to eval anything with multiple operators, it just bricks. So that's something just to be mindful of. That's a kind of an easy bug.
Yeah, with some operators. The pluses would be okay, I think.
I
and
tested
the
it on
minuses.
pluses and it broke. So.
Oh really? It doesn't. It can interpret it as a plus value, a positive value.
Yeah, you can try it if you want, but you have to do
Sure.
like 10 pluses, I think.
We'll do 1 plus 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 2, and I think that won't work.
Yeah, that might work.
Oh, that's interesting. So I guess you can't use a prefix plus to represent positivity.
You can also see console.log and see if that gives you, because eval, I'm guessing, is outputting maybe some issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh yeah, when in doubt, let's take a look at the inspector console. Invalid left-hand side expression. Interesting. So generally speaking, eval tends to be dangerous. I think we're okay here because there's no user input per se that is free-form. The input is only coming from those buttons. But generally, I think it's worth noting that eval, where you just say, evaluate the following code, can be very dangerous if some of that code might be coming from the user. Let's see, we're just after 2:30 here, Eastern time.
Let's
Are
go
there
ahead
any
and just make
questions or comments?
sure we didn't miss anything. So Babbitt was saying, I remember one old walkthrough where Rob Bowden and another fellow explained RSA, which went over my head like those paper planes they used to explain.
Indeed. Will there be a part 4? Well, we'll see. We're going to circulate the Google form, which we can do, I think, right at the end of the stream.
Yeah,
if you would like to
definitely.
contribute some of your own code.
We definitely still have quite a few projects left to look at. Adam was saying, I'm pretty impressed. When I was 10, I was still just developing the Linux kernel.
I think that's a little humble brag there.
Add a little lull in there. Sasha Kant, hello.
Babic Knight asks, can we use jQuery or Ajax for this? jQuery, absolutely. That would make some of the syntax a little shorter. Ajax doesn't really feel applicable unless you want to involve a server. Ajax typically involves talking to some endpoints, which we don't really have a need for here. In fact, I definitely don't want the user's input being evaled on my server. Better to keep that in their own browser. Every release, how late am I? Just about as late as you can be, I'm afraid, but we'll post the final video online, and you can go back on YouTube or Facebook and replay it, even this live stream in the meantime.
Yeah, if anybody is interested, bit.ly/CS50 Twitch code review. Submit that form, make sure your GitHub repo, make sure it's on GitHub. Somebody did post a GitLab project, which required us to register. So make sure it's on GitHub. And make sure it's public so that we have access to see it. Because if we can't see it, we can't show it, unfortunately.
Yeah, and really nicely done overall, Whip Streak 23. I would propose that the opportunity with this page and a few of the others is really to make successive versions of this. Like, it's great to get the calc.html up and working in this way. Go ahead and create a calc2.html, a calc3 that sort of advances the sophistication of each of them that might have been too hard to implement right out of the gate from the beginning, but once you get something working and you can make a slight improvement and another improvement, you can get pretty far from where you started. So I would consider doing that for something like this code and start to factor out a lot of these redundancies.
Yeah, it's always nice seeing all the different varieties of code bases and projects all the students are implementing.
Yeah, so feel free to post your code on the Google form. Let us know what to look at. We are well qualified for many, many languages and cryptographic algorithms. Feel free to reach out.
Yeah.
It's so nice to see so many folks in the stream again today.
Yeah, it was a good time. It looks like we're all caught up on the chat. So tomorrow,
What do we have coming up tomorrow?
CS50's own David J. Malan again for the CS50 Sandbox.
Oh, what is the CS50 Sandbox of which you speak?
We've seen it quite a few times here. So basically just allows you to spin up a little workspace, in the web. So you can just do it. You don't have to have a dedicated developer machine if you want to experiment. And you'll be talking much more about this tomorrow.
Indeed. Feel free in the meantime to play around if you'd like to get a taste of it. If you go to sandbox.cs50.io, it requires a GitHub account, but you'll probably already have one of those. You'll be logged in, and then you can simply specify what kind of sandbox to create. For instance, you'll see that there's support for bunches of different languages here, among them C and Python and HTML and more. And it's really just a quick and dirty way to get a programming environment up and running that is not permanent. It's more temporary. The CS50 IDE keeps your files and folders and all that around for as long as you have the account, whereas these sandboxes are meant to be just quick and easy, just as we've been using it for these streams.
And you just added Go, is that right?
Yes, but then we took it back, so now it's stop. But Go will be back, as will be Erlang and Prolog and Haskell as well.
No closure.
No, in fact, we have no closure right now either.
That makes me sad.
So.
Yeah, so we have the Sandbox tomorrow, so tune in for that one at 1 p.m. Tomorrow is Wednesday. I'm a little screwed up because of the week offset. On Thursday, I'll be doing Solitaire, which we were going to do last week, but unfortunately I was ill. So Thursday, tune in for a Solitaire stream, Love and Lua, so a game from scratch. And it's actually been like probably 2 or 3 weeks since we've done one of those. And then on Friday, CS50's Emily Hong is coming in for her very first stream on web scraping.
And I see a suggestion from Adam here for a data structure stream. Is that on the horizon?
Not one specifically, but I'm going to see if any folks might be amenable to holding one. That would be cool. I would enjoy one of those.
Yeah, plus we have this nice fancy way of actually drawing data structures on the screen where we could use some linked lists and some tree structures and some other such things.
Are you interested in doing data structure?
I'm not qualified to teach that.
Yeah.
All right, well, thanks so much. It's great to see everyone again.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow for the CS50 Sandbox. Until then, have a great rest of your day. And thanks to David and Brian for today's code review.
Good to see everyone.
Thanks, everyone.